We're glad you're here. You are the lucky recipients of a sociology lecture today. We are very graced by the presence of Professor Eve Blobom, who's here to talk to us about socialization, which is the chapter you've been working on with your independent practices for the strategies. So this is the time when you should already have your note paper out and be ready to take your notes over the assignment, over the lecture, right? So that is your responsibility today, is to be a receptive audience. We are recording this lecture, so just keep that in mind. Try to keep the racket in the background down to a minimum, which means nothing. And so please allow me the honor. Hey guys, this is way too much of that chitty chat, okay? Especially with recording going on. So please allow me to introduce Eve Blobom, and she'll tell you how long she's been around and give you a little background, and we appreciate you all giving her your attention. Thanks.
Okay, let's see. I started at JCCC in January of 2004, which, as far as I can tell, makes me old. So, I've been full-time for 8 years now, so I've been doing this a while. It keeps changing. It's not something you can keep doing the same thing over and over and over again, because the students change and the material changes and all the technology changes too. So, okay, so I was asked to talk to you guys a little bit about socialization, and what I usually try and do is introduce some discussion and some ideas in my lecture that are not in the book, so that I make sure I'm covering the important highlights of the book, but also bringing in some new material too. And I was a little surprised actually at how closely this chapter follows my own lecture. So this will probably be a little bit more overlap than I would normally have, including some of the boxed features were particularly relevant to what I usually cover. So, so what do you do when somebody sneezes?
Bless you.
Yeah. What about when you get on an elevator? What are you supposed to do? Make room? What else? Which way do you face? The door. Do you speak? No, not usually, right? If you encounter a stranger on the sidewalk, you're walking this way and they're walking this way, how does that go? What are you supposed to do? Smile, you politely acknowledge, but then do you keep making eye contact? No, you look away, right? You acknowledge each other's presence politely, but then you practice what we call civil inattention, which is just pretending that I don't see you. Sociologists use the term, comes from Irving Goffman, called an interaction shield. So this is a fabulous interaction shield I've noticed. If I'm walking through the mall and there's like the people in the booths that are fairly assertive about intruding on your time, I've noticed I can put my phone to my ear and just act like I'm talking to my mom on the phone and they don't talk to me, okay? But my point is there's a lot of rules for how we interact with each other in society, right? When we come into a classroom, how are we supposed to act? What do we do?
Walk in, go find your seat, and then get ready for class.
Mm-hmm. What if you come in and you're not the student, you're the teacher? Or if you come into the classroom, how do you know who the teacher is?
Probably sitting at a desk.
Right. So again, there's all these rules, and you guys all know these rules. I know you know them because here you are, right? Here you sit. But socialization is the process by which we learn these rules, okay? And a lot of these rules are not ever really explicitly taught to us, right? Nobody sits you down and says, listen, you're 4 years old now, you're probably going to get in an elevator sometime soon. If you haven't already been in one, here's what you do. You get on, you turn around and face the door, you push your button, and if you were having a conversation with someone when you got on, you stop, right? Did anybody ever have that conversation in their life that they can remember? No. So nobody sits you down and gives you this explicit lesson about here's how we behave in certain social situations, and yet we all know these rules. Well, socialization is the process by which that occurs. Some of these lessons are explicit, right? I had this very interesting conversation with my son at the airport when we were waiting at the baggage carousel, and the bags were coming out, and we're watching for our bags, and someone sneezed, and another person gave them some sort of response, but it wasn't bless you. It wasn't what we say when someone sneezes. And he thought that was odd because it violated his expectation of what we say when someone sneezes. They didn't say what we say. I don't know if they said Gesundheit or what, but so he and I had this specific conversation about, well, here's what we say, but other people say this, and it really doesn't mean anything. It's just something people say to be polite. So sometimes you do have those specific conversations, but a lot of this is learned just through observation, right? So just a quick definition of socialization is that it's the process through which we learn to be members of the social world, right? And one thing I want to highlight for you here. Does socialization end when you become an adult? No, it doesn't. It is a lifelong process. Okay, so a lot of the examples we're going to talk about have to do with what we learn when we were young. And yet, if you think about it, thank you. If you think about it, some of the things like choice of significant other, partner, spouse, whatever term you like, choice of a career, okay? A lot of those kinds of things, that is still socialization, and for many people that's occurring into early adulthood. Your book also talks about examples of resocialization, which include things like retirement or moving into a nursing home, right? So this is a lifelong process. There's always socialization going on. What we know from research as well as cases that have been documented, such as the case of Danielle in your book, other instances of neglected children named Anna, Isabel, Jeannie, you guys have probably heard some of these stories. We know that we have biological potential as human beings, right? We have the potential to do and create certain things. But if we don't have that socialization, that potential can't be realized, okay? Your book, again, talks about the example of Danielle. And in most of these cases, these are children who never learned to be fluent English speakers, okay? So that tells us that there's not only is socialization important, but in some cases there's sort of a critical period where if you don't learn those skills by a certain age, they may never be things that you fully master, okay? But that's socialization. So it's that lifelong process by which we learn to be members of the social world. And important words there are lifelong and social, okay? Members of the social world. So this is a specific type of learning that's taking place, okay? Socialization is one of the areas in which there's a lot of interplay and even some overlap between the fields of psychology and sociology. A lot of times people get confused about, are they the same? How are they different? But one thing I want to point out is that psychology is almost always focused on internal processes, okay? So mental or emotional processes, things going on within the human being, things that are specific to the individual, okay? Sociology is primarily focused on things that are external to the individual, the things that are going on around you, forces that are surrounding you but are outside of your control, okay? That's the focus of the discipline of sociology. So when we talk about socialization in sociology, we're going to talk about things like agents of socialization, right? Things that are external to you, forces that are not coming from inside of you, things you can't control. And what impact do they have on how you learn to be a functioning member of the social world? Okay, so there's some brief mention of psychologists like Freud, Erik Erikson. Jean Piaget is probably the closest, where there's the most overlap between psych and soc, because your book talks about how Piaget recognizes socialization as requiring a negotiation between kind of what we expect the world to be like and what the world actually is, right? So again, there's this negotiation or interplay between our internal processes and external forces. Okay, so Piaget is kind of a bridge, if you will. In terms of sociological theories about how socialization occurs, again, sociology sees this as a process that's driven by external forces, right? So Charles Horton Cooley talks about the looking glass self. Does anybody want to take a crack at telling me what the looking glass self is?
So the looking glass self is the socialization process that Cooley described by one learns how to socialize by watching everything around them they do, and as you become more aware through socialization, you can eventually look through to yourself.
Right. He's saying that essentially other people are a mirror, right? And we see ourselves reflected back. So, for example, if I'm up here teaching and I look around the room and everybody is struggling to stay awake or on their phone doing something, or this is my favorite one. Like we don't know what's going on under there. But that can begin to reflect back on me, right? So that's going to impact my perception of myself as a teacher, that I'm boring, right? That people aren't very attentive or I'm not doing a very good job, okay? So you're looking at the people around you and you're looking at how they perceive you. And that perception is incorporated into your idea of yourself, okay? And then George Herbert Mead, he talks about the unsocialized I and the socialized me. These are, if you have any familiarity with Freud, Mead's I is similar to Freud's id, right? In that it's the unsocialized, unrefined, very rough around the edges part of you, right? So this is the part that doesn't really care what other people think, right? That if you feel like picking your nose because it's bothering you, it doesn't really care who's looking. Okay? But the me is the socialized self. This is the part of yourself that does care, that knows that other people are evaluating you based on what they see. Okay? So for me, this unfolds in 3 stages. So you have the preparatory stage. And in the preparatory stage, the only thing children can do is imitate, right? So you might have a 1-year-old girl who mimics what she sees her mom doing, okay? Or she might imitate what she sees her dad doing. But all they're really doing, they don't have any understanding of the role that that person fills. All they're doing is copying the behavior, okay? Then in the play stage, children begin to understand the role of a specific other person. And I'm using the example of a daughter because my daughter is 3.5. So this is all very fresh in my mind right now. So in the play stage, my daughter mimics me. When she picks up a doll and pretends that it's her baby and she's its mother, she is mimicking me, right? She understands that she's taking the role of a specific other person. Okay? Then in Mead's game stage, children learn what he calls the generalized other. Okay? So now, if a child engages in playing house, the little girl is playing house, she's not necessarily just thinking about her mother. She's able to draw on what she knows about what moms in general do. Does that make sense? And children in the game stage also understands how roles are interconnected. So she might understand how moms act and how dads act and how siblings act. So now a child has a good understanding of not just one role within a family, but multiple roles and how different people might fill that role. So this is what my mom does, but this is what my friend Juniper's mom does. Okay? Does that make sense? One way that Mead said you can tell that a child has started to develop a generalized other is by whether or not they get embarrassed. Okay? That usually starts around age 3 or 4, around preschool age. Why would that be a sign that a child has a generalized other? Can you think of what that would tell you? If you're getting embarrassed, what is it that's the source of your embarrassment?
What other people think?
Right. It's what other people think. So it's the ability to view yourself the way another person would, right? And imagine how they would see that. So if oh my gosh, I had a professor once like trip in the front of the room and end up planting his foot in a trash can. So a professor who did that would probably get embarrassed because you know how it looks to the generalized other, to a typical other person is gonna see that as being silly, right? Which is gonna lead to the person who did it feeling embarrassed. Does that make sense? So again, the development of a generalized other, you can kind of tell by whether somebody is observed to be embarrassed. I've learned, again, through having my own children that usually, like in the toddler ages, like ages 1, 2, 2.5, a lot of times little small group activities involve an individual acknowledgement of each child. So each child gets his or her name called, and we wave and we acknowledge and, good morning, we're so glad you're here kind of things. And then there's all these little sing-song activities that they do in these group times. But by preschool age, most children get self-conscious about that much attention. So they tend to do, good morning songs that are less specific to acknowledging every single child that's there. So interesting stuff in sociology that I didn't really think of that way until I became a parent. All right, so some of the agents of socialization that we talk about. What's the primary agent of socialization? First one you have contact with? Family. And how do families teach us these rules of society? What are some things families do? What about with babies?
Oh, you take them out everywhere.
Take them out everywhere?
Yeah.
What do you do with a baby before it's even born? What do parents do?
Get an ultrasound and post it up on Facebook.
Hmm? And what is the first thing people ask?
Boy or girl?
Right. We are, as parents, picking out names. We're doing room decor. We're doing clothes. We're doing toys. There's all kinds of processes that are going into, even before a baby is born, teaching us how boys behave and girls behave, or what is expected of boys and what is expected of girls, right? Parents assign chores that teach us things about how to behave. Again, parents might have these very specific conversations about what we say when people sneeze, but children also learn this through observation, okay? Another important thing about family is family gives us a location within the social structure, okay? So we all have an identity in terms of race, gender, and socioeconomic status or class, social class, rich, poor, everything in between, right? Usually the family you're born into is going to give you that orientation as well, right? The family that raises you is going to be primarily responsible for teaching you about sort of your place in the social structure. Where do you fall, okay? And again, your book gives some pretty specific examples about how the lessons that children learn vary based on social class, for example. We see this in schools too, but working class and lower class families and schools tend to emphasize obedience, following the rules, conformity, not sticking out. In education, there tends to be a very heavy emphasis on basic skills, reading, writing, arithmetic, those kinds of things. Whereas upper class families and schools tend to encourage independent thinking, critical inquiry, creativity, those kinds of things, right? And what we know is that over time, essentially, working class, like parents with blue-collar jobs, will teach their kids the skills necessary to succeed in blue-collar jobs. And white-collar parents will teach their kids those skills, okay? And schools function much the same way. So that feeds pretty well into education, right, which is another important agent of socialization. Education is really important because obviously your family background, like I said, is going to have a pretty big impact on what your family teaches you about the social rules or which rules they emphasize. But education is like one big vacuum sweeper where we come along and we sweep up all of these kids from all of these diverse backgrounds and all of these diverse experiences, and then we put them in one room, right? Or one building. So education is one of the main forces by which we teach kids from a whole variety of backgrounds and experiences what? The rules specific to
People their age, or
age,
function in society.
yes, age, function in society, which is related to probably gender, race, and class. But what else?
How to succeed,
In
getting a job, going to college.
in what location?
School.
Nope. Where are you? Where do you live?
Nelson County.
Bigger?
Kansas.
There we go, yes. Your schools are one of the primary places where we teach cultural values, yes.
So, even if you have a budget, regarding the diversity of different students in schools,
Mhm.
there still is some diversity divided up among like different neighborhoods or different districts.
Mhm.
So wouldn't the values that they would teach in one school be slightly different from another?
Yes. Yeah, there's an extent to which that is true. But I will basically guarantee you every elementary school in the state of Kansas, let's see, I believe Monday is, anybody know?
Columbus Day.
There it is. I believe every elementary school in the state of Kansas this week and next will be talking about what?
Cuba.
Yeah, basically. They'll talk about Columbus. They'll talk about when I was a kid, it was the discovery of America, and we know a little bit more about it now. But and it tends to be a very rosy view, right? There was earlier, I think in September, there was Constitution Day, right? So my son is a first grader. He came home with a little booklet of American symbology, essentially, right? All these icons of American culture, flag and an eagle and a constitution, and there might have been like Lady Liberty, and I can't remember what all was in there, right? Did many of you grow up saying the Pledge of Allegiance every morning at the start of school?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I definitely did. I went to school in Nebraska, so fairly rural, fairly traditional places, right? Like Kansas and Nebraska particularly tend to do that. What are you learning when you're doing all of that? Conformity, but also these cultural values, right? Like patriotism. Yeah,
That is both
Okay, yeah.
patriotism
Yes.
or pride towards your country.
right, exactly. I heard a really interesting thing this morning on NPR where they were talking about political science professors and like how do you teach political science in a year in which the wheels have like totally come off and nothing's gone according to expectations in terms of Trump getting the nomination and what we've traditionally thought about the extent to which a party could control who received its nomination and those kinds of things. Trump has turned a lot of those expectations and assumptions in poli-sci kind of on their heads. And so they were talking to poli-sci professors, and one of them was from the University of Nebraska in Kearney, and he pronounced it Kearney, which would not have caught my ear had I not grown up 15 miles south of Kearney. But he was saying that there's always been this assumption, right, that college students come in and they've all been taught that democracy is good. Like, nobody questions that. Democracy is good, democracy is best. And this professor was saying she's always started this semester with a couple of readings to get students to think more critically about what are some of the drawbacks of democracy. And now she's finding that it's kind of the other way around, that these students are coming in and they're very critical of democracy. And so she's starting this semester with readings that try and paint democracy in sort of a more favorable light to challenge some of the assumptions that they're bringing into the room. Okay? But a lot of those assumptions about democracy is good and all of those cultural values that we have as Americans, we're learning those in school in a lot of respects. Okay? Your book also talks about the hidden curriculum. Do you all have a syllabus for this class? Or for other classes, you've had a syllabus, right? So when you think about what your grade in a class is based on, how much of your score is being determined by things that have really nothing to do at all with the content? Like, of your math grade, how much of it is based on the math you know and how much of it's based on other things?
Tests and quizzes make up a big percentage of math, whereas homework makes up a tiny percentage, and the finals like 10 or 15%.
Right? But your score on those things, is it entirely based on how much math you did correctly?
Some of it's based on if you turn in the pieces of paper.
Right. Obedience,
Participation.
conformity, right? Commitment, whether you're committed enough to show up. What else? Do any of you have mean and nasty professors like me who give 0 credit for late work under any and all circumstances?
Most teachers give 50% if you get it in the day. If not, it's 0 later on.
Mm-hmm. But what is that teaching you?
Obedience.
Right.
You need to do work.
Right. You're learning values like obedience, conformity, punctuality, again, commitment, some of these things we've already talked about. That's the hidden curriculum, right? So when you come into my class, which this semester all my classes are online, which is one of the reasons I'm so mean, you come into a class and you're reading, here's what we're going to talk about in this class. You've got this list of course objectives, right? But a lot of a student's grade in a class is not really based on how much sociology they could rattle off to me or how they can think sociologically. It's whether their stuff was on time. It's whether it was formatted correctly. It's whether it was uploaded to Dropbox like I told them in the format that Dropbox will open. Or whether I opened something and my computer went, can't open that. Right? So again, education, even in college, some of the things we teach don't have anything to do with the content of the course. You're learning those values and those skills to be successful where?
In their working world.
Right, in the workforce. Okay. Other agents of socialization, peers, obviously your friends. Peers take on a pretty significant role usually around the start of adolescence, right? It's about in adolescence when the amount of time you spend on a weekday with your peers begins to exceed the amount of time you spend with your family, right? So usually around junior high or maybe early high school is where individuals start spending more time with their friends than with their family, just in terms of number of hours that you're conscious on any given day that you spend with that group, right? So peers have a larger influence in it, and it sort of grows in adolescence. Sometimes the messages that we're getting from our peers conflict with those we get from our family. I believe that is mentioned in your book as well. Religious institutions and the workplace, political institutions, those can all be agents of socialization. I mentioned earlier that things like career choice, a lot of the experience of women who are entering their first full-time job out of college, particularly if they're getting married or are married and think about starting a family, women receive a lot of advice about how to balance work and home. Okay, that's part of that socialization process. I wanted to say a little bit about the media because the media is pretty interesting. We haven't always talked about the media as being an agent of socialization. When I first started teaching here, so what, 12, however many years ago, 12 years ago, 11 years ago? Thank you for that math. Yes, 14 years ago. We didn't talk about the media. It wasn't in my list of agents of socialization, but more and more we're recognizing that the media shapes all kinds of things. It shapes our ideas about normality. Friends was one of my favorite shows in high school and college. That probably dates me a little bit for you guys, but Friends showed people who were not necessarily always in the highest paying jobs, and yet these people all had, fairly nice apartments in, I think, Manhattan, right? In a pretty expensive part of New York City. So media paints a picture for us of what normality looks like, right? This is what people look like. This is what you can have with a quote unquote normal job. Whether that's, reflective of reality or not is oftentimes a different question. The news media is really important. I don't know how many of you have been paying a lot of attention to this, but typically when there has been someone shot and killed by police, what is the image of the person who was shot and killed that is usually on the news media?
Innocent person or a minority.
If it's a minority, what is the picture? They'll pull pictures from Facebook, right? Here's the person.
He didn't do it. They'll say, he didn't do it.
That's not the image I'm seeing.
They show their mugshot.
Right.
They'll show the mugshot.
Oftentimes we'll see these images pulled from their Facebook pages where they're presenting sort of like what I would associate more with like a hip hop sort of look, right? We're not seeing pictures of them with their kids necessarily, or their families. We might see a mugshot, or we'll see a picture of them like with a drink or with a cigarette or something like that. That's been a long running critique, but it has certainly been sort of more frontline media here recently just because of everything that's been going on. Yeah.
I think that's kind of beginning to change because, especially with the big cases, I've seen more pictures of them with their kids or family or spouse.
I would agree with that. I think it is beginning to change, and I think in part, I'm just offering conjecture here, but in part I think that's because so many of those cases have been front and center in the media recently, so the criticism of those images has also been getting a lot of attention. I think they're maybe a little bit more aware of it than they used to be, and they're being a little bit more conscientious in how they select those images. But if you think about it, I'm just using this as an example. If you think about it, what we see in the news is what we perceive to be truth and reality in a lot of cases, right? And so when the news picks what they do and don't cover, a lot of people, I teach social problems, and a lot of my students want to talk about the liberal media and the conservative media, and there's some legitimate debate to be had there, but to me, that's not the most interesting thing. What's interesting is what are the social issues that not a single mainstream news channel even covered? Like what happened in the world that day that we don't even know happened? And we don't know what we don't know. You get what I'm saying? So the news media has a really powerful impact on what we understand to be real and important, right? We have a tendency to think that if it's in the top 5 news stories that night, that it was one of the top 5 most important things that happened. And I don't know if that's always the case. The news media pick stories based on use, right? How does it serve their interest, and what's their interest as news media? Viewership, because viewership drives
Profit.
right. Okay. Let's see. I think that's about half an hour. Is that a good stopping place?
Sure.
I mean, I could get into more, but
No, do you all have any questions for her about these agents of socialization?
okay. I think if I go on, it's going to be another 20 minutes. It's kind of
Yeah, no, it's really good though. It's perfect. So, okay, so let me ask one question while I have you. So, how did you know when you should write something down that Professor Glowbaum said? She wrote it on the board.
I wrote it on the board. I used audio cues, like I have the 3 stages that I guess she wrote it down? Sure.
Yeah. What else, Kevin? Did you
If
have
you
something?
reference something from like our part in the book, I wrote some of that stuff down. She made some references to that, like who being mean and the looking glass cell.
Right, she referenced particular sections of the book. Okay. Anything else? Anybody have another? Like, what are some of her other cues?
High quotes or specific people it says based on the topic.
Sure, she referenced particular people. Any other cues? Not necessarily about the content, but how you knew what she was saying was important. What'd she say or do?
She told us when she wrote like definition of socialization, I thought that was pretty important to have in the notes.
She repeated that almost how many times?
At least 10.
Yeah. 3 or 4 at least, right? What else, Christian?
Brought up specific big, topics such
Yeah.
as religion, peers, curriculum, hidden
Did-
curriculum.
Did you notice when she gave an example, sometimes she would ask you all a question too and ask you to think of some? Yeah. So, you are lucky. It's great teaching. We appreciate it so much. I think you might be wasted behind the computer. I know that's important too, but I think that it's a good example too. You saw how quickly she went, right? How many pages did you take? I got 5.
I can't write that.
Well, it's too common spread out, so I can write notes. Go to my book. When you said it was in my book, I could have starred write book, so I could go back to it. So, okay. Well, tell her thank you in some way when you say your Really appreciate your time. It's wonderful. So, for you all, in your plans notes, please remember that when your professor ends the lecture, you draw a line and you put a what? Don't forget the to-do box, right? So do you all have any homework in your other classes for the weekend? What do you have? Do you have anything for us in tips over the weekend?
Maybe.
Summary.
Okay. So definitely to write your summary might be in your to-do box, right? Otherwise, what will happen if you don't write that down?
Get a 0.
You'll totally forget it and you won't do it, right? Don't record me anymore. I'm done. Okay, so write your to-do box, leave some space for a summary, and then when we see you on Monday, we will expect to see a summary.